everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be continuing on. I decided to continue on with my reading of the complete Crepax, Mr. Crepey Paper himself, if you're a fan of what we do in the shadows. But I was pretty sucked in. I don't know why. I just never liked reading these. I've always liked looking at them, and for some reason I got a hair up my ass to read volume one and enjoyed it and wanted to see how he continued handling the interesting idea of the majority of the erotic material being based on a traumatic experience that the lead character Valentina had early on in the comic stories that he was doing that were about another character. She was the girlfriend of the Philip Rembrandt Neutron character who was his sci-fi guy, and then Valentina kind of took over very quickly. But in the early stories, she had been abused by a species of underground people. And in the first volume, at least, it seems like that's the core of her neuroses and her erotic fantasies and her therapy sessions. And I was really curious to see how he continued to play that out, if it just becomes a reason to draw BDSM, or if there's some real depth to it. And so far, so good. This one has a lot of depth to it as well. So really enjoying these. I don't know what clicked in my brain, but I'm really starting to enjoy these. As always with Crepax, one of the things that's most interesting to me and why I was buying these, even though I originally didn't enjoy reading them, was that the just formal play that he does is always like, he's never running out of ideas. He's always trying something new and always doing it masterfully. So in this one, it really interesting, these borderless compositions that he's doing. This also harkens back to a story I'm forgetting. No, this is referencing the story that's going to come next, where Valentina is having a dream and she's got these two women that look alike, which is a big thing in the next story in this book. So that is really interesting, and it follows the path of what was going on in the first book that I think turned me off to these reading experiences. And I saw a little bit more in this book about why this is the case. Is these aren't being reprinted in the chronological order that they were finished or done. And so the stories jump around a lot and it's a bit confusing, but they're trying their best to categorize them. I was curious about why they're doing that. And part of it is because Crepax himself would return to stories. So a lot of the stories will have stuff tacked onto the beginning of them or put in the middle and the end. And so that made it hard for them, I guess, to even find what is the right chronological order. He would publish it in this magazine and then release it as a book in this version and then do it again over here. So I guess that made a purely chronological collection difficult anyway. So they decided to go with this thematic one. So that's interesting. He's setting up, this is from 1970. And then we turn to this page here, and we see that this is a therapy session that Valentina's doing, and it is her talking to a therapist about what happened to her in the subterranean tunnels, and also finding out that her lover is half one of these creatures that she's so traumatized by, and she's telling her therapist that that's something she's struggling with. So that's where it's like, okay, that's what I was hoping for. This is continuing on with this very rich psychological exploration rather than being completely exploitative porn. So that first story is in 1970. That's a prelude to this story, The Force of Gravity, but this story here was drawn in 1967. So you're reading something that came out 3 years later, but it's a prelude to this. So you're getting these weird kind of stylistic jumps, and things feel jumbled in places just because of the ordering. But as you go, you start to piece it all together. You don't pick up on the fact that these are the two women and it's potentially referencing characters in this story. But afterwards, you realize why these two women were part of this dream that she's relaying to her therapist. So I guess it's just a kind of a hard to solve debate about how you organize these things, how you curate them. There's this doodad here in this one, which seems to be kind of iconic for Crepax as like a sci-fi, which is what this collection, the first one was like horror stories, this is sci-fi related stories. So there's this strange contraption that shows up, similar designs multiple times in this book, but this is some kind of robot, and it's gonna reach out and grab this lady and attach itself to her and try and mimic her, and that takes a while to piece out as the work goes on as well. In this story, Valentina's also in a mental institution. It doesn't say exactly why. She had some episode, so that's where it's like information's missing, because the story that carries that information is probably in one of the later volumes, and that's the problem of not being in chronological order. But it's okay. It's a little bit of a game. Like, I think once you get the basics of how the story works, it's easier to start piecing them together as you read them out of order. Like I said before, I think that was one of my barriers. Initial, like, my response was always like, great art, stories don't make any sense. I don't know, they're not worth reading. But that's changing for me now quite a bit. So yeah, now Valentina's in a mental institution. You see a lot of that rhythmic grid work that I always talk about with Crepax's work. Then you get the two women that we're talking about, and you have Martha and Zelda. And Zelda is a model, and Martha is basically this robot that is trying to become Zelda and replace her, and has her locked up in the mental institution. So you see them here. Also had to notice the Linus poster on the background. This most likely would have been coming out in the Linus magazine, I'm sure. And then also the Surf's Up Snoopy poster there. So calling, these like fun little Easter eggs throughout the stories. He likes to do that with musicians, authors, other comic artists. So someone who's really paying tribute to all of his inspirations and wrapping them up into the stories. There's a really interesting sequence here where the Zelda character is talking to Valentina and uses this spider to mix up their dreams. And there's just a lot of like hypnosis kind of things going on in there, influencing someone's dream. Like, you're seeing what's out in the real world, you're seeing the wallpaper, and you're seeing how that impacts the dream. So just interesting story structures as well that really delve into psychology. That seems to be a major interest for Crepax. Here again is the doodad, the little sci-fi thing, and you can say, oh, mission accomplished. You could see it's doing that. It's trying to create like facsimiles now of Valentina as well, and they're putting all these things in storage. There's obviously a larger story I don't know quite all about yet. Then there's the insertion here of actually what's going on. This is called Comic of a Comic. So it's like a summary of what's happened up to this point. This is where you learn that this little thing here latched on to the Zelda character and starts presenting itself as Martha. The next story is called Valentina in Boots. This is now 1968 that this one's being produced. This is post the story Valentina in Soviet Land, which is in volume 1. This has another where there's a robot in it. So you have this character here that's Frank Stone, who's also a robot. And also looking at this is just more evidence of like where I think more people should be talking about the influence that Crepax had on Frank Miller. I even went and searched it to see if Frank Miller, if that's something that's talked about, and I found maybe like 2 posts where people are acknowledging it, that Miller was influenced by this guy and showing some panel-to-panel comparisons, but not much, surprisingly. So I want to keep pointing that out. It's hard not to see that all throughout these things. In this dream sequence, there is a little bit of dialogue I found interesting where it justifies the story structure as being psychoanalytical at the core. Valentina is kidnapped by the like giant, this is how she's seen the Frank Stone guy. Now he's like this bebop type of character, rocksteady bebop guy, and bringing her to a sorcerer saying, here's the patient. The sorcerer obviously is her therapist in the dream, and he's saying, oh, my dear friend, between the conscious and unconscious there's a sieve, and on top in the conscious only the biggest objects remain, while the sand for the mortar of life falls down into the depths of it, and on the top only of the brain remains, while the bran remains, while the flour of the bread of life gathers at the bottom in the unconscious. So really talking about, like, yeah, that's what this story is about, is sifting through someone's subconscious, and that's giving an excuse to do all these fun, wild, surreal, erotic images that obviously Crepax is most interested in drawing. By the end of the story, the robot has now turned itself into a cat, and Valentina adopts the cat. So I'm assuming that the robot cat is going to continue to play a role in further stories. You can see here that the cat is also being advertised as being part of the next story. So I'm curious to see how much of a character that cat is throughout the different volumes, but I think it's a very strange set of stories where you've got this woman meeting a robot woman who turns into a robot cat, but then you're also doing like this psychoanalysis, dream, erotic study. I think that was probably one of the barriers for me as well early on, is it kind of feels like swerving, and until you get a sense of how the panels denote where you're at in reality or in someone's head, that was a little hard to keep up with as well. Here you see the robot as the cat again, and she's complaining that she's being crushed by it because it's heavier. I'm sure it's like dense. But this is another one where the story probably starts here originally, because this is signed from 1968, and then the beginning sequence is 1969. So either he was working on it at the same time and just went back and added this to it, or came back to the story later, which I think is probably what happened, because that's happened a number of times. Some really fun compositions here. This is the type of stuff that initially drew me to Crepax, just the abstraction, the zooms, the fun graphics throughout. Here's another one where we've got Crazy Valentina instead of Crazy Cat, so another little Easter egg in there. But yeah, just love all of these abstraction through zoom. A lot of elements that are on this page over here get zoomed in on over here. A lot of things that are zoomed in on over here show up in the pullback here. We get like all of those elements. So really this whole page is like an aspect to aspect type of panel transition, as Scott McCloud would define it, and then it's just basically zooms of this larger beach scene here, and you get to see all the cool patterning, all of that like mod design, the high couture, all the patterning is something I really love about Crepax as well. Once you get a hold of how Crepax uses the different types of panels as well, you can see that he's including some really interesting information on this page, from reality to imagination, violent detachment from reality. So usually he has squared off corners when it's in reality and rounded off corners when it's in a dream or someone's imagination. He'll use dots for like stories and things like that. In this one, he's talking about she's kind of like in between. She's being amphibious right now, where she's both in reality and detached from it. So the panel borders are using his own language, and you see that these first three are half in reality and half in the fantasy, and then you head into all of these that are 100% fantasy. So really subtle things it takes being an attentive reader, and he's training his audience over time. Like once you've read a few of these, you pick up on that, and then it's less of a barrier for further reading, because now you understand his language, which is cool. This volume also has a number of pieces where we start getting self-referential to Crepax as the creator. So here, Philip, her partner, says, "You're such a good cook, we might even have to get married." And Valentina says, "Well, we should ask Crepax about that." There's this play where it's like, yeah, we all know that, I'm Crepax's like fantasy woman, his ideal woman. It's based on his favorite actress. I look like his wife, so we better ask the creator about that. And I like those moments. Some more of these cool like aspect to aspect type of panel transitions where there's really no order. You can just look at the page as a whole and get a four-dimensional sense of a scene. I really like that. That's influencing me a lot on Bound. I know I've talked about that before. Another Easter egg here. Catch that cheeky child, Ignazio, and you have the Ignatz character from Crazy Cat. Obviously some Harriman, especially I think the paneling is something that he picked up from Crazy Cat. And then there's even on her dresser here, you can see a point to the little wind-up toy and a book of Crazy Cat comics here. In this story, now the robot is attempting to be Valentina rather than Zelda, so you have this third character, Mariana, who now is the attempt to be Valentina, but you can tell her by the longer hair at first. You can see this is real world stuff. Now Valentina has been captured. So the BDSM stuff's not always in the fantasy. It's always a bit uncomfortable, seeing someone fantasize about hurting and torturing someone else. But, there are people who like it too. So no judgment there. This all seems consensual. Really fun piece here where a child's drawing, and given the fact that there's some interview with Crepax's kids as adults in here. There's photos of him playing custom board games that he built with his kids. It seems like he was a real family man as well. So it's very easy to imagine that he probably had his kid draw this. If not, then good on him for being able to mimic the way a kid draws. But I found that really fun. In this sequence, you get more evidence that the subterranean trauma experienced in the early story by Valentina is continuing to be a theme for her. There are these effigies here, these kind of scarecrow creatures that are being sculpted, and they remind Valentina of the subterranean, and even says the traumatizing images of an obscure ceremony. So this ceremony that she was forced to participate in the subterranean world. That keeps me hopeful that, this stuff will continue to be, while being erotic and pornographic, will also continue to be thoughtfully written, and written from like a highbrow standpoint, I guess, if that's possible to say. And that continues here with the continued Easter eggs, where Valentina's been laying on the sand and she's like wet, or they put the suntan lotion on her here, and she turns over and like stains the dirt with it, and he says, "Oh, you made it, Klein." He's referring to Yves Klein, where Yves Klein would paint his models blue and then squish them up against a canvas. And so she falls asleep on the beach, and that comment there leads to her having this dream where she's being painted and squishes herself against a canvas. So all of those like little cultural bits of culture, bits of stuff that are showing how someone's constructing their interior state is really interesting to me. This is someone who has to know all of these artists and properties and stuff, and that's helping form who they are and how they're dealing with their trauma. That actually becomes an interesting story, even if it is mostly a vehicle for a guy to draw pictures of sexy women. The next story is then from 1973. This is called The Time Eater. Really, really love this illustration of this bird here. The brushwork on this is absolutely gorgeous, and you can see almost some of his Alex Raymond. I know was a fan of Alex Raymond. You can see some of the inspiration in the brushwork here. It's really almost sad to me when Crepax moves away from the brushwork and starts getting into all this fine cross-hatching work. I really kind of like that earlier stuff that would have been influential on Frank Miller for its brushwork, but he does also have very beautiful, delicate pen work, and as you get into the 70s, you start seeing that. So this is another one, starts in 73, and maybe it's just a crossover he's working on at the end of the year, but we move into 1974. Valentina's running into this astronaut character. So again, remember, we're in these sci-fi stories, and there's some interesting, in this, Crepax really starts to play with reading order, and it can get mixed up sometimes. I think by this point in 74, he's got it pretty well worked out where he can snake his way around pages. My biggest criticism of some of the stories in this volume is I really got lost in some of the pages, but I feel like that was him playing with how to do different things. It feels to me like he doesn't ever want to do the same page layout. It feels like there's some ethic he has that every page should be approached differently, and I think it takes him a while to figure out how to do that while still preserving reading flow, and so you get some in these earlier stories that are messed up. But once you get into like the mid 70s, it seems like he's got that pretty well sorted out. But he is playing with reading order in a way where, like here it reads well, like you can kind of read down here, but then Here it does start to get mixed up where you're supposed to read like this and my instinct was to read like that. It's very strange for me to be on this panel and then like jump over here and then have to come back to that. But he is kind of playing with some of these loops as well, and that's something that I've stolen from him, is that ability to like scatter the images around the page and try and have them make sense. That's something I'm trying to steal. Very cool polyrhythmic stuff. I just have to point that out anytime it's really strong, because that's one of the key components for me in Crepaux's work. I just think it's so beautiful the way you'll have all these little ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta things running against other, and the way the borders line up or don't line up. It feels very musical to me. Really, really love that stuff. Then we jump back to 1967 for a story called The Pirate Ship. This is a totally non-Valentina related sci-fi story, and this is earlier in his career, I think, when he's trying to still be a sci-fi artist. And you can see that he has some pretty great sci-fi chops, like totally wild designs. These night characters with all these cameras and extra sensors sticking off their head. It's not just a strange design element, it has function, but it makes them look both like futuristic and archaic at the same time. And you can see he's got some really cool, spaceship designs and stuff like that. This is the bigger, brushier, more graphic work that I actually kind of prefer. Now, I think I used to probably like the fine pen work stuff better, but I really like the impact of these images. So these characters, I forget, I think they're traveling around to different planets, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and you're just getting to see some cool stuff. Like here they're in a planet where it's water, and you've got these kind of stingray fish. Just a lot of really cool images throughout these sequences, especially these big ones like this. I really like his compositions on these. Again, a really good look at all of the cool mix between like futuristic and archaic piratey looking type of designs. I don't think I've ever seen spaceship stuff look like this before. You can see the influence of like Alex Raymond and the strip artists doing fantasy adventure strips, but definitely taking it into a very strange, unique, singular, personal vision. And that speaks a lot to him as an artist, that he could have probably had a whole career being like this weird, sophisticated sci-fi artist, and just swerved in another direction as his interests took him there. Here they're on Neptune. I bothered to make a note on that one. This representation again of them underwater and Neptune, just some beautiful compositions. Something else I've noticed throughout the two volumes is that there's a lot of panels where gravity seems upset, whether it's just from characters tumbling or characters holding each other up upside down, people floating. He seems to be very interested in anti-gravity or flying and floating, and you can see that. And I just love the strange composition here. I don't even know what this structure is, but really cool abstraction. At the end of the story, you get a little map, kind of like how he had the map of the underground story where Valentina went to Subterranea and got traumatized. This has a fun little map of like all the different ships that are in the story, where they went at what time. So another thing that I feel like I gotta get Brandon onto Crepax. I don't think I gotta ask Brandon. I don't think we've talked about Crepax, but he needs to be looking at this stuff. But something else, this idea of like games that Brandon's really into, other ways of like diagrams and stuff coming into comics. It's fun to see Crepax playing with those. So that story there was done in 1967. In 1972, then you get a really fun follow-up to that story, which gets really complex in a really, really fun way. So there's a whole bunch going on in this story that's worth pointing out. So we start off with an interview. We have some just voice interviewing Valentina. We're seeing like her driver's license or whatever, her ID card, and they're asking questions. Do you love Neutron? Well, I don't love Neutron. I like him when he's Philip Rembrandt, but when he turns into the superhero guy, not so much. They're asking her about her tastes in music, her tastes in art, her tastes in like here, what do you think about women's lib? And she just says, I like to be liked. Here, what do you read, if you call it reading? And you've got Trotsky and Freud. So you're seeing basically Crepax's interests. What movies do you watch? It's saying how many times she's watched them. Then you get these final three panels here, or these final three questions. I guess you could count this as a panel where the person starts saying, "Are you fond of Crepax?" He draws me so well, I wouldn't let anyone else do it. When he dies, I will kill myself. Do you love Crepax? I am bound to him by loving friendship. He made me from nothing. I owe him everything. Are you really sure? Yes. So he's playing with this idea that people, know that she's like his core character, and it's kind of lustful. Then you get here again the idea playing out. They ask about like, what about the other Crepax girls? Do you think that you're better than them? And she's like, yeah, I'm like his main squeeze. Uh, Are you sure? Are you really sure Crepax is Valentina? Didn't you say that? Any idea who Crepax really is? He's a hard-headed child. Do you trust him? Isn't he, after all, just a man? I trust him like I trust myself. But now let me get dressed. I have to finish reading an old book to Mattia. Mattia's her son. So this is another one of these sequences that got stitched onto something, because this section, well, some of these don't even have dates on them, actually, which is strange. He tends to date everything, but it was here in 72. Then we switch over to this page, and this is done in 76, that this story's done. So he like started this and then didn't keep going with it or something. And then this page here says 79. So he added in this illustration of her reading in 79, and you see she's reading the Space Pirates story from the previous story. So it seems like this would have been the starting panel at some point, that this page was inserted later and these were inserted in God knows what order. But here you get the start and you get the end of the Space Pirates. And now this is 1976, so you have a big jump in time between the two stories. And Valentina's reading that story to her kid, and her kid Mattia says, "Oh, it's over already. Well, what happens next?" And Valentina says, "We should ask Crepax about it, because we don't know." And then she says, "But go to sleep now, Mattia. You can continue the story in your dreams." So then you get this really fun thing where Crepax is able to do a follow-up to his own story, but couch it in a property that he cares more about. This is something thematically that's in a couple of these stories at the end of this book, where he's kind of like, it seems like readers are saying, "We miss your sci-fi stuff, blah, blah, blah," and he's not really into it. People want to know the end of that story. What'd you ever do? So he's able to answer those questions, but make a Valentina story. And then he tells a really psychologically interesting and sophisticated story in this. So the first sequence is her son, Mattia, dreaming. And then this is, at first I thought it was a bit strange, because this is supposedly Mattia dreaming about his mom, and then to have his mom be like this sex vixen in these erotic situations is a bit strange to me. But as I went further in the story, I think what's happening here is we're supposed to be reading this as now Mattia has woken up the next day and is recounting his dream to his mom, and this is how she's imagining herself in his dream, where he's telling her, "Hey mom, you went and you were on the ship and you were involved in finishing the story." I think that's what's happening there, which gives him the pass then on, like, it's a little bit weird if her kid is having a dream like this about her, with all these dominatrix with their titties out and stuff. So I think this is then her interpreting the dream, which again makes it really interesting that she is the core character. We're getting a peek into her child's head because of the dream that he tells, but we're also getting a peek into her head because we're seeing how she's visually interpreting it. And I'll show why I think that's what's going on in a little bit. In terms of the anti-gravity stuff, this is another sequence here where he's playing with reading order, but also using it to create like an anti-gravity tumbler effect. So they're in a spaceship, and this woman's crawling into this ship that's rotating, and you see how the characters start like rotating throughout the panels, and there's like this weird kind of roiling force going down the composition of the page there. I think it's really interesting, sophisticated stuff. Again, really hard not to see, this like Frank Miller doing some direct swipes of some of these faces and some of these costumes. Then you get this big splash, which is the beautiful image that's on the cover. Just absolutely love this illustration. Then you get Valentina thinking, oh, like Mattia, he didn't finish the story though, so maybe like I can fall asleep and think about it. And she's saying, my husband's not here, I hate sleeping alone. So she falls asleep. Doesn't do the normal rounded out sleep panels, which is strange. But then Valentina continues the dream. And you'll see that the way she looks remains consistent. So that's one clue to me that this is how she's thinking of herself rather than how her kid was thinking of her. So she completes her dream, which has all of this really cool stuff with this horse in it, just really fun images that give Crepax a lot of chance to play with texture and stuff. Then you get, then she tells her husband Philip about her son's dream, and then I had a follow-up dream. So she tells him that, and then instead of Philip going and dreaming, Valentina and Philip have a conversation where he's like, let's play a game, I'll finish the story for you. So then the story continues and comes to a conclusion with Philip telling the story. And again, you have visual consistency. And in this one, you have Valentina interjecting in these circular panels, like, oh, you killed Armstrong too. He was so cute. Were you jealous? So you're seeing that all these characters are her mental representations of them. Like, oh, he was cute. Silly. Hadn't we agreed on killing all the characters? So they're having this other conversation. So you get this really interesting, like, total package look at the psychology of a whole household where you get the inside of the kid's head, you get the inside of the mom's head interpreted and slapped on top of the kid's head. Then you get the conversation between the husband and her wife, continuing the story that the kid kicked off. And as the adults take over, the stories get more erotic than what the kid's story was if you take away the imagery. So they're imposing like a more erotic interpretation on all of that. And that's where I became convinced, instead of being something gross, this is actually something really clever and really sophisticated in terms of writing structure to have this one story. And then having that whole other like interview tacked on the front of it, where Crepax is basically admitting that this is Valentina is him, just makes the whole thing really fascinating and bizarre. And all the different times that this got put together, this is stuff that he's mulling over and coming back to. So it's really selling me on the project. And when I say project, I mean his project with Valentina stuff, at least as a whole, is very interesting to me. And at the end, then they're talking about that. Obviously, the story gets them worked up. They have sex, and in the aftermath, they're talking about, I should say, afterglow. Afterglow, they're talking about how kind of silly the story is. Sure, they were nice, but love and death, or rather death and love, nothing new then, nothing new to say. And Philip says, nothing new ever happens in adventures. It's always a matter of form, right? We're too old for adventures anyways. We'll ask Mattia to make up new ones with other characters. As far as I'm concerned, this story is over. So he's telling his audience, like, I'm done with it. There's nothing new there that's interesting to me. What's interesting to me are matters of form. And then you can see, like, that is his concern. He's a very clever formalist as a writer, that he has this very clever formal structure for telling the family psychology, and he's very interested in formalisms as a visual artist as well. And the fact that he's speaking to that and telling his audience, like, no, I'm a grown-up now, man. Like, this is now the 78 that this is at. So we're jumping around again on the timelines here. Some of these aren't, they don't have the date in the signature either. Yeah, 78 on some of these. So who knows when and where that all got compiled together. But that's probably my favorite one so far. I think the writing in that is about as good as it gets. That's a fantastic thing. And I really feel like this would be one that would be worth coming back to after I've read all of the material, because there would probably be references to so many other things that are symbolically important to the characters themselves, that the interpretation, the Freudian interpretation of the dream from the reader's standpoint would be easier. The final story in here is another early one from 1967. This is about Belinda, another female lead, and she is chasing down a character called the Vinyl Vor, just a character that goes around stealing vinyl records. So again, that interest in music and jazz and classical music and stuff comes up. Some more very obvious to me images that were inspiring Frank Miller. I don't know how you look at those nose and lips and the whole Catwoman and the poses and the way she's glancing, the way her eyes are done, and not see Frank Miller just stealing from that. Then you get a continuation of this story. Again, this is another one of these where he kind of left an episode hanging and then moved on to the Valentina, the more serious stuff. It seems like for some reason the audience compelled him to come back, and he's coming back all the way in 1982 to where at the end of this story, the Belinda gets put kind of in, she goes onto a spaceship, and then here now you're waking her up. And he's acknowledging after 15 solid years of slumber, they're waking her up from cryogenesis. And there's just like a short little end to that story, which basically kind of says the same thing about it being silly. And then just, it doesn't, as far as I could tell, doesn't really end either. It's just like he let it drown, then he got bored with it. So I thought that was interesting as a set of statements too, and I like that they curated it that way. A, it makes sense that these are all the sci-fi stories, and B, there's kind of these two statements about why he moved from the one type of story to the other. And then it includes, like I said, what I think is my favorite one so far and the most sophisticated in terms of writing. So really enjoying volume 2. It is definitely panning out to be what I hoped these stories were, and I'll probably keep doing this for all the volumes until either it's too pornographic that I can't show any of the pages, or that the stories just are no longer interesting to me or whatever. But so far, the first 2 volumes, I'm finding so much, not just in terms of the art, but in the writing and all this other stuff. If you haven't got these, they're pretty expensive, but they're absolutely worth it. They're beautifully designed books. The covers are amazing. They all have these different textures on it. They're super classy on the spines. They sit really nice on the shelf. They're friggin' huge. They're the length of my arm. Great reproduction. So well worth the money if you can afford it. The Eisner nominated The Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Dave Sim and myself. This is a gorgeously illustrated and designed book. Dave doing most of the illustration. Amazing compositions throughout. What Dave is doing is he's recording his obsession with the death of master cartoonist Alex Raymond behind the wheel of Stan Drake's car when they got into a car crash. The best description of the book that I've heard is that it's like understanding comics with pages like this mixed with something like From Hell when you get into the theories about, you know, what actually happened with the car crash. And then with Sean on production, it's just one of the most gorgeously printed books you could get a hold of.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.